I grew up hearing the legends of the Yeti, the one creature who, as a child, I feared more than anything else in the world. My parents and grandparents would sit around the fire, recounting tales passed down through generations, stories meant to remind us of the power and mystery hidden within the mountains. To outsiders, it might seem like folklore, stories meant to entertain, but to us, the Yeti is as real as the snow on the peaks. People think the Yeti is just a tall tale, a fabrication to scare children or thrill tourists, but we know otherwise. My uncle once told me of a night he spent high in the mountains, right where snow and ice coat the world in an endless white. It was late, and he had been on a long trek with a small group of climbers, all of whom were seasoned mountaineers. The night was still, and only the distant howl of the wind interrupted the quiet. Then, out of nowhere, they heard something, a low rumbling growl that echoed off the rocks. At first, they dismissed it as the sound of shifting ice, but as the growls grew closer, each man froze, exchanging nervous glances. The growl turned into an almost human-like wail, a sound so chilling that it made their hair stand on end. My uncle swears he saw something move just beyond the edge of their torchlight, a large shadow that seemed too big to belong to any animal he knew, and the footprints, massive, far larger than a human's, were pressed deep into the snow around them the next morning. They had heard stories, of course, but that night, for the first time, my uncle was convinced that the Yeti was real. They packed up and left as quickly as they could, vowing never to return to that part of the mountain. But this wasn't the only tale I've heard. Many Sherpas believe that the Yeti isn't merely an animal, it's something more powerful, something almost supernatural. Some say that the Yeti is a guardian of the mountains, a spirit bound to the peaks watching over those who dare to ascend. If someone goes missing on the mountain, they say the Yeti might have taken them, either as punishment or perhaps to save them from a worse fate. There's a legend about a Sherpa named Dorje, a young man known for his fearlessness and strength. One winter, he attempted to climb a particularly dangerous peak on his own, against the advice of the elders. Days passed, and Dorje didn't return. Search parties combed the area, but all they found were enormous footprints leading away from the place where his last camp had been. No one ever saw Dorje again. The elders said the Yeti had taken him, punishing him for his arrogance. But others whispered that Dorje might still be out there somewhere, held in some secret cave, watched over by the Yeti. They say the Yeti's eyes glow with an otherworldly light, and that it has a wisdom far beyond our own. Some believe that if you are lucky, or perhaps unlucky enough, to meet its gaze, you'll be haunted by dreams of it forever. And then there's the tale of Tenzin, a seasoned Sherpa guide who once took an expedition deep into the Himalayas. Tenzin had always been skeptical about the Yeti, laughing off stories as nonsense. But one night, high in the mountains, something changed his mind. His group had settled in for the evening, sitting around a small fire, when they heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Tenzin assumed it was an animal, maybe a snow leopard or a bear, but the sound grew louder, closer, and soon, an overpowering smell filled the air, a stench so foul and musky it was like nothing he'd ever experienced. The other climbers went quiet, their faces pale as the footsteps drew nearer, and then, just on the edge of their firelight, they saw it, a massive, hulking figure covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes, yellow and glowing, looked directly at them, and Tenzin says he felt a shiver run down his spine, a fear that gripped him in a way he'd never known. They say that when the Yeti stares at you, it sees into your soul, into every secret, every fear. Tenzin told me that at that moment, he understood the power of the creature and he realized why it was so revered. The Yeti isn't just an animal. It's a force of nature, something that embodies the raw, untamed spirit of the mountains. Then there are the Banjakri and Banjakrini, the so-called jungle shamans. They aren't like the Yeti, they're something entirely different. They're half human, half spirit, and they live deep in the forests, at the foot of the mountains, hiding in the shadows, watching anyone who ventures too close. The Banjakri is a male spirit, often depicted as small and agile, his body covered in hair with a face that's both human and animal-like. But the Banjakrini, the female counterpart, is far more dangerous. She's said to be tall, beautiful, but terrifying, with sharp claws and long flowing hair. Some say she can appear as a beautiful woman to lure people deeper into the forest before revealing her true form. One of the most unsettling stories I've heard is about a young boy named Pasang. He was curious, always wandering off into the forest, despite his mother's warnings. One evening, as the sun was setting, he wandered farther than ever before, drawn by strange sounds, drums and chanting, echoing through the trees. He followed the sounds until he came upon a clearing, where he saw a group of figures dancing around a fire. The Banjakri was there, his small agile body moving to a rhythm only he could hear, while the Banjakrini watched, her dark eyes fixed on Pasang. They say that the Banjakri and Banjakrini are always looking for apprentices, young boys to train in the ways of magic and healing. But it's not a gift, it's a curse. Those who are taken by the Banjakri are never the same. Pasang disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he was different, silent, withdrawn, his eyes filled with shadows. He would not speak of what happened, but his mother said he would wake up screaming in the night, as if reliving something he couldn't escape. Others tell of strange encounters in the forest, hearing drumming and chanting just out of sight, feeling eyes watching them from the darkness. My grandmother once told me that if you ever hear the Banjakris drumming, you must turn back immediately, no matter how curious you are. The spirits of the forest are not to be disturbed. They have their own world, their own magic, and they do not welcome intruders. The elders tell us these stories not just to frighten us, but to remind us of the power that surrounds us, the spirits that inhabit the mountains and forests, and the delicate balance that keeps our world in harmony. For us, these are not merely stories. They are warnings, reminders of the invisible forces that share this land with us. In the mountains, in the forests, there are things that walk beside us, things that watch us, and they are very, very real. There's a legend among our people about a ghostly figure who haunts the high mountain passes, a cursed soul known as Langur Burja. Every Sherpa knows this name, and every Sherpa respects the tales that surround it. Langur Burja is said to be the spirit of a hunter, a man who defied nature and paid a terrible price. Some say he was once a brave and skilled hunter. Others say he was ruthless, taking more from the mountains than he ever needed. Whatever the truth, it is said that he crossed some unseen line, and now he wanders the peaks as a restless spirit, a wraith bound to these icy heights for eternity. My own father told me the first story I ever heard about Langur Burja. He said it happened when he was a young man, on his first solo trek over one of the highest passes. He had set up camp for the night, finding a small shelter beneath a rocky outcrop, and huddled close to his fire to ward off the biting cold. The wind was fierce, howling like a beast through the pass, but he thought nothing of it. He was used to the mountain's ferocity. But as he sat there, something strange began to happen. A heavy, unnatural silence descended, cutting through the wind's roar. It was a stillness so deep, he said, that it felt as if the world had stopped breathing. And then he felt it, an intense, overwhelming sensation of being watched. He scanned the darkness, peering into the shadows just beyond the fire's glow, but he saw nothing. Yet, the feeling only grew stronger, pressing down on him until he was certain something was out there, something hidden in the dark. My father said he'd never felt fear like that in his life. It was an instinctual terror, a primal feeling that told him he was in the presence of something beyond human, something that did not belong to this world. He whispered a prayer, hoping for protection, but the sensation didn't fade. Then he heard footsteps crunching through the snow, slow and deliberate, as if someone was circling his camp, watching him. My father dared not move, barely even breathed. He listened as the footsteps stopped and started, drawing closer, then retreating as if taunting him. And then, for a moment, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing just on the edge of his sight, a tall, gaunt shape, cloaked in mist. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but somehow my father knew exactly who it was. Langur Burja, the cursed spirit who roams these mountains, always searching, always watching. My father shut his eyes, whispering another prayer, and when he looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only silence behind. But this isn't just my father's story. Many Sherpas have encountered Langur Burja, each with their own terrifying tale. There was another climber, a man named Tashi, who went missing for 2 days while crossing a treacherous pass. When he finally stumbled back to camp, he was shaken and weak, his face pale as though he'd seen death itself. Tashi told us that he'd lost his way in the snowstorm, wandering blindly for hours, until he found himself on the edge of a cliff he didn't recognize. He was exhausted, disoriented, and he thought he might not survive the night. That's when he saw him. A tall, shadowed figure standing on the far side of the cliff, watching him with hollow eyes. Tashi called out, thinking it might be another climber, someone who could help him find his way. But the figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and still. Tashi tried to walk away, but no matter which direction he turned, the figure seemed to reappear, always in the corner of his vision, as if guiding him or maybe trapping him. He described the experience as a nightmare come to life, every turn he took leading him back to that same spot, face to face with Langur Burja. Some believe that Langur Burja is a spirit of vengeance, one who punishes those who disrespect the mountain or take more than they need. Others say he's a guardian, warning people away from dangerous paths or protecting sacred places. But whatever he is, there's no denying the fear he strikes in the hearts of those who encounter him. Tashi eventually found his way back, but he was never the same. He barely spoke of what happened, only ever mentioning those hollow eyes watching him in the darkness, following his every step. Even I had my own encounter with something I can't explain. It was a few years ago, on a climb with a group of foreign mountaineers. We were on our way to a high pass, pushing forward even though the weather had begun to turn. I felt uneasy, a sense of dread hanging over me, but I tried to brush it off. It was just the mountain, I told myself, just the weight of the journey. But as we climbed higher, the feeling intensified. I could feel the presence of something watching us, something lurking just beyond sight, and I could see that the others felt it too. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously as if they could sense it too, though they wouldn't dare say a word. That night, as we huddled around the fire, we heard a sound in the distance, the sound of footsteps echoing off the rocks, slow and deliberate. Every person in our group went silent, straining to listen, but no one dared to move. And then we saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, standing at the far edge of the camp, motionless. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. One of the climbers whispered, "Is that someone else out here?" I shook my head, unable to answer, too afraid to look away from the figure. As we watched, the figure slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, echoing around us, as if the figure was circling, watching, always just out of sight. No one slept that night. We huddled close to the fire, listening as those phantom footsteps moved around our camp, fading in and out of the silence. By dawn, the footsteps were gone, but the feeling lingered, an eerie reminder of the presence that had watched us all night. Langur Burja is more than a legend. He's a reminder that these mountains have a life of their own, a spirit that cannot be tamed or conquered. Some people say he appears to those who are lost, guiding them back to safety. Others insist that he only comes to those who have broken some unspoken law, drawing them deeper into the wilderness until they vanish forever. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. The mountains are filled with mysteries, and Langur Burja is one of their most terrifying secrets. To this day, when I pass through those high mountain passes, I feel his presence. I never travel alone, and I always carry offerings, small tokens of respect, just in case. Because out there, under the weight of the peaks and the cold, there's more than just rock and snow. There's a spirit, a shadow bound to these mountains, watching, waiting, reminding us that the mountain has its own way of keeping balance. Whether it's vengeance, protection, or something we can't even understand, Langur Burja is out there. A phantom of the pass, a warning and a mystery, forever tied to the land that we call home. There are stories among the Sherpas, old tales of spirits that live within the rivers and lakes of the Himalayas. We call them Chota Koshi and Bahotak Koshi, names that carry an air of reverence and fear. These spirits, they say, inhabit the icy waters, watching over the currents, guiding them, and at times, luring unsuspecting souls into their depths. They aren't like other spirits. They are elemental, ancient beings who have existed as long as the rivers themselves. And though they rarely show themselves, they make their presence known in ways that cannot be ignored. When I was a boy, I used to think of the rivers as beautiful, inviting places. The shimmering blue, the icy white edges, the way the water seemed to dance and sing as it moved through the valleys. It all seemed so peaceful. But my grandmother was quick to correct me. She would say, "Don't trust the rivers, child. They are alive, and they are watching you." She would tell me tales of people who vanished without a trace, drawn to the rivers at dusk, following voices that weren't quite human. "The Koshi spirits don't take kindly to arrogance," she warned. "If you listen too closely, you might hear their call, and once they have you, they don't let go." One story she told has stayed with me all these years. It was about a young man from her village, a shepherd named Dawa. He was known for his bravery and his skill, often going up into the mountains alone to care for his flock. One evening, he took his sheep to drink by the banks of the Botak Koshi, a river known for its icy waters and strong currents. As dusk fell, Dawa sat on the banks, listening to the sound of the water rushing by, the cool air settling around him. And then he heard something strange. It was a soft, lilting melody, almost like a woman's voice, singing just above the noise of the river. Curious, he leaned closer, peering into the darkening water. The voice grew louder, clearer, and Dawa, entranced, leaned even closer, as though the voice was pulling him toward it. He swore he saw a face beneath the water, beautiful and haunting, staring up at him with eyes as cold as the river itself. The voice became a whisper, calling his name, urging him to step closer. Dawa's friends found him the next morning, his body half submerged, his expression frozen in terror. They say that the Chota Koshi had claimed him, that he had dared to listen to the call of the spirit and paid the price. But that wasn't the only story I heard. There was another tale, told to me by an older guide who had spent decades climbing and exploring these mountains. He warned me never to sleep too close to the rivers, especially during the dark winter months when the spirits were said to be most active. He recalled a night when he and his companions had made camp near a bend in the river, exhausted from a long day of climbing. As they settled in for the night, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing across the water. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the laughter grew louder, more distinct, and it was unmistakably human. One of his companions, a young climber unfamiliar with these legends, laughed it off and moved closer to the water's edge, saying he wanted to see where the sound was coming from. The older guide shouted for him to stop, to come back, but the young man seemed entranced, as though the sound had a grip on him. He reached the edge of the river, peering into the darkness, and then, without warning, he slipped. Or at least, that's what they thought. He disappeared beneath the surface, the dark, icy water swallowing him instantly. The guide swore he saw something in the water, a shadowy figure with outstretched arms, pulling the young man deeper and deeper, until he was lost. For hours they searched, calling his name, shining their torches into the river, but he was gone. Only his footprints remained, leading to the river's edge. The guide told me that night. He felt the presence of something watching them from the water, something that lingered just below the surface, waiting, as if satisfied by the life it had claimed. They say the river spirits are always hungry, always looking for a way to pull unsuspecting souls into their depths. These stories have a way of sticking with you, especially when you find yourself near the rivers at dusk. I've had my own unsettling experience with the Koshi spirits, though I can't say for certain what it was I encountered. It was late one night during a trek near the Chota Koshi River. I had set up camp a safe distance away, but the sound of the water was unmistakable, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to carry through the night. As I lay there trying to sleep, I began to hear whispers, soft and indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they carried a strange, almost melodic quality, as though they were singing rather than speaking. I opened my eyes, feeling a chill wash over me, and looked toward the river. In the moonlight, I thought I saw something moving along the bank, a pale, ghostly figure that seemed to glide over the ground, leaving no footprints. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe as the figure moved closer to the water, its form rippling like the surface of the river itself. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, melting back into the water without a sound. I lay awake the rest of the night, listening to the sound of the river, feeling as though the spirit was still there, watching, waiting for me to make a single mistake. Over the years, I've heard countless stories like these. There was a fisherman who claimed he saw hands reaching up from the depths of the Botak Koshi, long, bony fingers that brushed against his boat before disappearing back into the icy blackness. Another climber spoke of seeing strange lights hovering above the river at dusk, glowing orbs that seemed to dance over the surface before sinking into the water. They say those lights are the spirits themselves, a warning to anyone foolish enough to venture too close. Even now, the rivers hold an unspoken danger, a reminder that these spirits are always present, always watching. When we pass by the Chota Koshi or Botak Koshi, we leave small offerings, a bit of food, a flower, something to show respect. It's a custom we've followed for generations, a way of acknowledging the spirits and asking for safe passage. We know better than to challenge them, to ignore their presence. The rivers are beautiful, yes, but they are also deadly, and the spirits that dwell within them are as fierce and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. I've learned to tread carefully, to listen to the whispers of the river without giving in, to respect the Koshi spirits and the land they protect. There are places in these mountains where humans do not belong, places claimed by forces older and more powerful than we can imagine. And the rivers, those shimmering, glistening currents, are gateways to those places, places that lie beyond our reach, guarded by spirits who remind us of the boundaries we must never cross. To this day, whenever I guide someone near the rivers, I tell them the same thing my grandmother told me. Never underestimate the power of the water, and never, ever ignore the whispers. For in those whispers lies the warning of the Chota and Botak Koshi, the reminder that these spirits are real, that they are watching, and that once you hear their call, there may be no turning back. In the Himalayas, the mountains are more than just mountains. They are sacred, living beings, guardians with spirits older than time itself. The Sherpas have a deep respect for these peaks, and we know them not just as landmarks or challenges, but as realms governed by powerful deities we call the Lamo. These mountain deities are fierce protectors, and their presence is woven into every rock, every gust of wind, every flake of snow. They are not just stories, they are very real, and the consequences of angering them are something every Sherpa knows all too well. Growing up, I was taught that the mountains must always be approached with humility and reverence. The Lamo are said to have a dual nature. They are both kind and merciful, yet wrathful and unforgiving when disrespected. People might laugh at this idea thinking it's just superstition, but anyone who's been on these peaks knows the truth. The mountains have an energy, a force that you can feel, almost like a heartbeat beneath the snow. And when the Lhamo are angered, they let you know in ways that are impossible to ignore. One of the most famous stories about the Lhamo is that of a climber named Sonam. Sonam was known for his skill and confidence, often leading treks up some of the most dangerous peaks. He respected the mountains, but was also somewhat dismissive of the warnings about the Lhamo, calling them old stories that didn't apply to modern climbers. One year, Sonam was leading a group up a particularly sacred peak, a mountain said to be the home of one of the most powerful Lhamo. Before they set out, the village elders had asked him to offer prayers and make a small sacrifice as a gesture of respect, but he brushed it off, saying they were on a tight schedule. They began their ascent and the weather was perfect. The skies were clear, the air calm. It seemed like the mountain was welcoming them. But as they reached a high point, an intense, bone-chilling wind came out of nowhere, sweeping down the mountain with a force that knocked them off balance. Sonam tried to lead his team forward, insisting they could push through, but the wind only grew stronger, cutting through them like icy knives. His group grew uneasy, urging him to turn back, but he was determined. Then, as they moved forward, a low rumble echoed from the peak above, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the mountain. The ground shook beneath their feet, and they watched in horror as an avalanche began to form, a massive wall of snow crashing down with unstoppable force. Sonam tried to get his team to safety, but it was too late. The avalanche swept them down the slope, and by some miracle, a few of them survived. But Sonam was not among them. When they found his body, his face was frozen in a look of terror, as if he had seen something in those final moments, something no one else could see. The elders said that the Lahamo had taken him, that his disrespect had angered the spirit of the mountain, and she had claimed his life as punishment. His story became a warning to others, a reminder that no matter how skilled or confident you are, the mountains are not ours to command. But the Lamo's presence is not always about punishment. There are tales of their protection as well. Stories of climbers lost in the snow on the brink of death, only to be saved by what they believed was the intervention of a deity. I remember one story, told to me by an old Sherpa named Pemba, who had once been trapped on a high isolated ridge during a brutal snowstorm. He was certain he wouldn't make it through the night, and he sat down preparing to succumb to the cold. But as he sat there, half delirious from exhaustion, he saw a figure emerge from the storm. It was a woman, cloaked in white, her face hidden but her presence warm and reassuring. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, and Pemba swears that in that moment he felt a warmth spread through his body, melting the numbness in his limbs. The figure pointed to a small crevice in the rock nearby, a place he hadn't noticed before, just big enough for him to crawl into and shelter from the wind. By morning, the storm had passed, and when he looked out, the figure was gone. Pemba believed it was the Lamo who had saved him, guiding him to safety in his time of need. He always said that the mountains have a heart, and if you respect them, they will protect you. Another story that comes to mind is that of a foreign climber who had no understanding of our customs or beliefs. He was determined to reach the summit of a highly revered mountain, and despite the warnings of his Sherpa guides, he ignored every tradition and every plea to honor the spirits. They asked him to leave an offering, a simple gesture, but he refused, scoffing at their beliefs. The guides were uneasy, feeling the weight of the Lamo's gaze, but they had no choice but to follow his lead. As they climbed, strange things began to happen. Their equipment malfunctioned, ropes snapped without warning, and they were hit by a sudden snowstorm that had not been predicted. The foreign climber grew frustrated, cursing the mountain and calling it just another rock. And then, as if in response, a silence fell over the group, a stillness so profound that it seemed as if the mountain itself was listening. Moments later, a strong gust of wind swept through, and in that instant, the climber lost his footing, slipping over the edge. The Sherpas managed to save him, but just barely. They told him afterward that he had been lucky, that the Lamo had shown mercy, but he laughed it off, saying it was just bad weather and coincidence. He made it to the summit, but when he returned to the village, he fell ill with a strange sickness, one that no doctor could explain. The villagers believed the Lahamo had marked him, that his disrespect had cost him something, a price he would carry forever. I felt the presence of the Lamo myself, especially on certain mountains, where the air feels heavier, the silence more intense. There was one climb in particular, a sacred peak that few dare to attempt. I was guiding a group, and as we made our way up, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as though we were being watched, judged even. I urged my group to make an offering, and thankfully, they listened. We left small gifts, a piece of bread, some rice, a flower, and as we did, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle warmth, as if the Lahamo had acknowledged our gesture. That night, as we camped near the summit, I had a dream. In it, I saw a woman standing on the peak, her figure draped in snow, her face a blend of kindness and fierce power. She didn't speak, but I felt her presence fill me with a deep sense of peace, a reminder that we were welcome only because we had shown respect. When I woke, I told my group about the dream, and we spent a few moments in silence, thanking the Lamo for allowing us safe passage. The Lamo are not just legends to us, they are real, ever-present guardians of these mountains. They remind us of the delicate balance between humans and nature, of the respect we must show to forces beyond our understanding. The mountains are not ours to conquer. They are sacred, living entities, and to disrespect them is to risk everything. Every Sherpa knows that we walk in the realm of the gods here, that each step we take is a privilege granted by the Lamo, and so we tread carefully, offering our prayers, our gifts, and our gratitude, hoping that we are worthy in their eyes. The Lamo are both a blessing and a warning, a reminder that the mountains are not just landscapes but sacred realms, where spirits older and stronger than we can imagine reside. They watch over us, sometimes guiding, sometimes testing, but always reminding us that we are guests in their domain. The mountains may seem like stone and snow, but to us they are alive, filled with power and mystery. And it is the Lamo who guard these secrets, who stand as eternal sentinels over the peaks, watching, waiting, forever intertwined with the land we call home.